Hello, my esteemed classmates. I'm Erin Kerr. Before I get started, I just want to thank you so much for your writings, for your insight, your feedback, your brilliant intelligence. It's just been such a pleasure working with you guys, and it's nice to see each other in person on these videos. So I chose chapter 9 of our textbook, Psychology of Emotion and Restorative Practices. Chapter 9 is called Affect and Emotion in a Restorative School. The chapter begins on page 200 and goes to 230. And the focus of chapter 9 is basically restorative practices being utilized by teachers in classrooms. The opening is beautiful. It reminds us of how challenging it is to be a teacher and of how teaching is an intellectual labor, but it's also a moral and an emotional labor. And you know how teachers themselves are just on their journey. They're fallible humans making this valiant attempt to enrich the lives of others. But it's a very public forum. All eyes are on the teacher, the students, the administrators, the parents, and their colleagues. And so it just goes into an appreciation for the challenge of of being in an enormous group, like 25 people at least, a classroom setting. So to use restorative practices, the point is obviously that it's going to really help. So the teacher that understands and knows really how to use and leverage the tools can better impact their subject matter. And also they are better equipped to handle at-risk students and compass of shame behaviors that may crop up in the classroom environment, which are basically, as we know, withdraw, avoidance, attack self, and attack other. And then the teacher can do a lot to bring awareness first and foremost to their own. There's a saying, you cannot transmit something that you haven't got. So really to be super aware of their own compass of behavior, go-to behaviors, and then to be able to utilize skills to take that painful shame response and then transmute it into a helpful guilt response, basically a behavioral response, a behavior change versus, attacking the self, as which is, the pain of shame. But when they can do that for themselves, then they can teach those skills to their students when their students are suffering also. Shame is painful. It calls into question the worth and value of the whole person, but it can be helpful too because it motivates change. Guilt, on the other hand, is tied to behavior, which is more easily managed. And it doesn't threaten the self per se, but guilt, according to this chapter, can also be maladaptive when someone owns responsibility for for everything, right? They pile guilt upon themselves needlessly, and that's when it becomes maladaptive. But both shame and guilt can be adaptive emotions when processed through restorative practices. The recognition, one thing that I thought was impactful was the concept of cognitive shock. So that is like when a deep shame response has been triggered in a student or anyone, the brain kind of shuts down. And I know that the shame response is the heading of the head, that hanging of the head, slumping of shoulders, averting the gaze. That is cognitive shock, and really there's not much going on in the frontal cortex at that time. But in students, it looks like disrespect and willful disengagement. So the proper interpretation, and this is not in the chapter, but I know that it takes at least 20 minutes basically for the frontal cortex to come back on. And I'm not sure how a teacher in a classroom could give that student that break to just sort of reorganize themselves and recenter after being shocked. I know that it would be hard as a teacher, and yet I think it would be helpful. That's just my own interpretation. It's useful for teachers to understand the 9 affects, the 9 innate affects that all humans have, and then it's also useful to understand that different students have different attachment scripts and different compass of shame behaviors, and that's going to dictate a lot of how and where they go offline. But in an ideal situation, and it's page 217 of our book, an ideal situation for a teacher would be, I don't know if you can see this. Yes, you can. So to alternate between interest as a subject is introduced, and then enjoyment for students after it's learned, and then a new topic, interest, teaching happens, enjoyment after the mastery is achieved by the students. So that was something on page 217 from chapter 9. The circle leverages the central blueprint, increasing positive affect, decreasing negative affect, and creating space for expression of all affect. Bad feelings can be safely shared. Attention, which is often lacking in the home lives of students, is given. Empathy and compassion are given. Using the restorative questions, the harm is redefined as a behavior, and new ideas for new behaviors can be suggested and adopted. For even the most abused and neglected students, in this chapter it says that research shows that attachment wounds can heal their shame responses well into adulthood. So that's encouraging. Most importantly, these behaviors can avert what the author calls the spiral of shame, and that is when a teacher reacts to the shame response of others with their own shame defense. And it can result in really embarrassing situations, regrettable situations for teachers. So the spiral of shame was something that was introduced in chapter 9. The key takeaway is that a well-facilitated circle can help teachers to use the social discipline window to stay with their students, to support them, and to mentor them for emotional coping strategies that can be shared by the group and then facilitate success academically and socially as well as emotionally. That's a tall order for a teacher in a classroom, but RP can help that. So this week's reading and this chapter is the realization that everything, even the most logical and scientific and rational, at its core is motivated by emotion and by affect. And if a teacher can meet their students there and support them affectively, everything else will be easier. Restorative practices helps teachers do this important intellectual, moral, and emotional labor. So, thank you so much. Have a good day.